We're several weeks into reopening economies, both in the US and outside the US. But what does reopening the economy look like? And is it working? These are some of the questions we're going to talk about in today's Advisor You Can Talk To podcast. Hello, and welcome to another Advisor You Can Talk To podcast. I'm Jeff DeMaso, Director of Research here at Advisor Investments.
And I'm Liz Laprade, Research Analyst at Advisor Investments.
Great. Thanks for joining me today, Liz. We're going to do things a little bit differently today. Rather than just having one moderator and one speaker, we're going to shift roles and trade off roles as we both want to share a little bit of research we've been doing into pandemics, coronavirus, and the current economic environment.
That's right, Jeff. But before we begin, I do want to say that all of us here at Advisor Investments are saddened and pained by what we are witnessing in our nation. Racial injustice and inequalities that have long been seen but unacknowledged by many in our society are finally coming to the fore in public protests that we believe are necessary to improve conditions for all Americans, regardless of their skin color or social standing. While painful, we are confident that protesters' voices will finally be heard and that our nation will find a way through this and emerge the better for it. So, Jeff, I know that you've talked about the fact that we've actually been here before in the US in a way, and which was surprising to me and maybe others, but actually certain generations have already lived through pandemics here. Can you just tell me what that looked like and why does today feel so different?
Yeah, we often try and look back at history to see what we can learn about our current environment. And the big pandemic that everyone jumps to is in the 1918 Spanish flu. It's gotten a lot of press, but it's actually, I think, a tough one to use for the current comparison. First off, it's over 100 years ago, and our economy was just dramatically different back then from today. And the second is that it's hard to separate its impact on the markets from World War One. Both were pretty dramatic events at the time. And then, unfortunately, there have been two other flu pandemics that the CDC estimates resulted in over 100,000 American deaths, which is a
Wow.
pretty grim milestone. And
Hmm.
want to acknowledge the human toll that comes with those. Uh, but again, trying to put that aside and focus here on economies and markets. So let me quickly talk about those two past pandemics, give us a bit of history lesson there, and then talk about why it's so different today.
Perfect.
Um, First, 1957, 1958 was the H2N2 pandemic, resulted in a million deaths worldwide and 116,000 here in the US. So dramatic uh, toll on human life. From the market perspective, stocks did go into a bear market on the first wave of this virus. Um, but interestingly, the second wave, which was unfortunately more severe, marked the bottom in the market, and stocks rallied nearly 40% in 1958. So markets had kind of adjusted and come used to the pandemic environment. And then the next one came just about 10 years later in 1968, which is the H3N2 pandemic. And it actually evolved out of the 1958 virus and interestingly is still circulating today in the world.
Hmm.
Um, Now, the stock market did not have a good late 1968 or 1969, falling some 35% or so. Notably, this virus also had a second wave, which was less severe in the US, but more severe overseas. So pandemics don't always hit each part of the globe equally. But from the market and economy perspective, 1968-69 was a pretty volatile time. Maybe some actually parallels to draw today, but there was a presidential election in 1968. The Vietnam
Hmm.
War was a driving factor in the American psyche at the time. There was also issues around race and unfortunate assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. So it's
Hmm.
hard to say specifically what was driving the market. To say it was just the pandemic um, driving the market at that time.
Right. So, I would say history doesn't repeat itself, but then what are you taking away from these past pandemics?
No, it's a good question. So, I mean, first off, it's two data points, so we do have to be careful about drawing uh, too much of a conclusion. The 1958-57, suggests that markets can rally off of bottoms coming out of pandemics.
Hmm.
The 1968 experience tells us that maybe there's more than one thing always impacting the economy and markets. Probably the bigger takeaway is that we've overcome the flu before, and I think we can do so again. The really, really big difference today is the policy response. In the 50s and 60s, we did not have widespread shelter in place lockdown of economies, where today that was a pretty standard response in many parts of the US and across the globe. But then I guess it brings us to where we are today, and we're starting to reopen the economy in countries. And how we manage the restart to the economy, if we can do it, it's a question we've heard a lot. It's a question we're asking ourselves. And maybe we can kind of flip roles here because, Liz, I know you've been digging into how reopenings are going, both at
Hmm.
home and abroad. And I
Yes.
guess since we can't travel now, maybe you can give us a virtual global tour. Um, but before we embark, maybe kind of pack our bags a little bit and just what data have you been looking at? Kind of set the stage for this trip, and then we can kick off.
Sure. Let me just say, overall, I think things are headed in the right direction. Broader economic data, meaning when I'm looking at other countries and how they're doing, a lot of that is lag. So, for example, unemployment numbers may only be reported every few months in a certain country. So, we may not see those numbers in time, meaning today, to make any sort of conclusion from it. But we are able to look at the economic and medical data and some other, I guess, unconventional sources of data that gives us more of a real time look. So we're looking at things like Open Table, which shows us, are people going out to eat again? Are they making reservations? We're looking at Google Mobility. Are people moving around again? And how are they doing it? And truthfully, just observing what's going on around us, right? We're in Massachusetts and we've been in a shelter in place for months now, but there are other parts of the country that have started reopening. And I'll talk a little bit about that when we get there. So basically, I've looked at different countries, including the US, and then I've looked more granularly at some of the states within the US that have started reopening either end of April or early May.
Okay, great. I think that sets the stage for this tour. Before we get to the US, let's start with Asia and we'll move from there.
Okay, sure. So China is probably the most well followed country to reopen early, which makes sense. It was the epicenter of the disease and it started all the way back in sometime in December. Economy there is basically back to at least 80% capacity. People are eating out again, people are traveling again, people are, schools are open, things are looking pretty normal there. And cases have been on a steady decline for months. Average new cases a day since the beginning of May are 6. So, assuming you can trust the data, you could definitely say that China's, beaten the virus. And in fact, things like auto sales have rebounded really quickly there to pre-coronavirus levels. Some attribute that to cash subsidies that citizens received during the time when the economy was shuttered, similar to something we had here in the US. And maybe you can infer it's a transportation thing, a societal change, right? Maybe people are a little more nervous about walking in crowds or taking public transportation and using some of that extra cash to purchase a vehicle. So that was a interesting data point to see coming out of China.
I agree, Liz. I think that's one of those questions of how will behavior change coming out of
Hmm.
this
Right.
period. And maybe it's less public transportation, means more driving, maybe more
Hmm.
bikes. I think we've seen bike sales here in the US tick up as people are looking to get around on their own on 2 feet or
Yeah,
two wheels.
definitely. Definitely. We've seen that in Europe too. Bike sales are just through the roof as an alternative way to, yeah, get around places without feeling like you're, in a big crowd. So, sticking with broader Asia, let's talk about South Korea. South Korea has been applauded for the way it handled the virus. They never had to do complete travel bans or really strict shelter in place lockdowns. Some of that could be attributed to what they went through in 2015 with MERS, which is also coronavirus disease based. It wasn't as deadly, it wasn't as contagious as the coronavirus we're seeing today. However, they learned a lesson through that. Government and health officials didn't do a great job of containing that virus back then. So what happened after that was they created organizations and policies that are really focused on tackling a pandemic or an outbreak if it were to ever happen again. So when they saw the first case come out in South Korea, which was actually on the same day we saw our first case in the US, which was January 21st, they acted really quickly. They started aggressive testing, they were tracing aggressively, they were putting in distancing measures, and citizens were adhering to all of these warnings. So they were able to kind of put health officials and advice in the front seat, and people listened to them. And that went really well for them. In fact, retail sales are getting better, but they did hit a bit of a speed bump early May. So the economy early May was pretty much at full capacity, similar to China, and to the point where nightclubs were open. So you're looking at crowds, close quarters, people probably yelling over the music, and someone had coronavirus. So it started to spread. You're trying to track thousands of people down that may have been exposed, and you did see cases spike up. When I say spike up, I want to be sure to say that that's relative. When I say spike, I mean it went from maybe 12 new cases a day to 90, but at its peak, it was, 1,000 new cases a day. So we're not looking at what I would call a second wave, but you did see a spike come out of this event with the nightclub. And in fact, South Korea had to kind of take a step back and shut schools down again. So that's definitely something we're watching very closely to see, are they able to contain this small outbreak, or what's going to happen.
I think the relative numbers are helpful because, as you say, it's not a second wave, but an isolated outbreak. And we've seen actually similar ones in China where they've had small outbreaks that were able to be contained. So maybe a sign of what's to come here. But now let's pivot. What are we seeing in Europe, and are there any lessons we can learn from how they're faring?
So Germany and Denmark, specifically in Europe, have done really well, and they're still doing well today. They've broadly maintained new cases trending down since they started reopening, with some small spikes along the way, but really well overall. Germany sort of led by example in Europe, and they attribute this to aggressive testing. They actually started developing a test in January before they ever really saw a big, uptick in cases, and they had test kits ready to go across the country. So they were able to start testing not only those that were coming in and having symptoms, but people that didn't have symptoms, right? And you, if you don't have symptoms, it's almost more dangerous because you don't know, and you're going around and you're interacting and you're spreading it, and you don't know you're spreading it. So that was really big that they were able to test both sick people and people that were asymptomatic. Whereas here in the US, we kind of started just testing those that were coming in really sick. So I think that was a huge factor for Germany doing so well. And in fact, Germany is one of the first data points we see from OpenTable showing that they're actually seeing reservations for restaurants higher than they were a year ago from today. So 30% higher than a year ago from now. So that's great. People are going out to eat again. Restaurants are getting income, coming in. So that's great news to see. And they're actually opening shops this week. They're raising the number of gatherings much higher, and people are actually able to visit nursing homes and assisted living again, with restrictions, of course, but you can kind of think of those places as the last place that reopening goes. So they're pretty far down the line as far as getting back up and running. And then Denmark was one of the first to shut down amid the coronavirus breakout, and one of the first then to reopen. And they attribute this to, they didn't wait to see any wave before they shuttered their economy. Their 7-day moving average of new cases was about 100 when they shut down, versus the US, we were closer to 1,000 by the time we started doing, shelter in place. And they essentially shut down to the same extent as we did here in the US, just much earlier. And they were actually the first country to reopen schools in Europe. So both Germany and Denmark acted quickly, had aggressive testing, and it worked out well for them. And to date, it's definitely going really well over there.
Okay, so some encouraging signs, at least in terms of
Definitely.
countries' ability to reopen.
Absolutely.
All right, bring us home. What are we seeing in the very large United States?
Yeah. So the US still has a long way to go here. New cases are definitely starting to flatten out. But I decided to look at some of the states that opened early on to maybe guide some expectations. So I took a look at both Georgia and Texas. Both states had declining 7-day moving averages of new cases before they reopened, which is, a huge factor for that decision on reopening any part of your state. They both reopened early May, and the reopening phases looked very similar. They opened spaced out dining, so restaurants were open to a smaller capacity and tables were further apart. They lifted shelter in place. The hair salons were open and social distancing was relaxed. But since Georgia has opened, new cases and the moving average of new cases has continued to increase. It has not declined yet. So I also saw a spike after last week, which I think is probably attributed to the long weekend. There's probably some travel, so people coming from out of state into Georgia. So that's something I'm keeping an eye on. But, on the other hand, open table reservations there are up about 30% from where they were basically at zero in April. So that's good news. And, still keeping an eye on how they're going. Texas, very similar to Georgia on the medical side, both states, hospitalizations are down, which is great. The increase in number of tests performs, there's been a lot more testing going on, which is a good thing, right? We're trying to catch as many people as possible. But in Texas, the percent of those tests given that are positive are flat to declining, which is great. There was a slight uptick as well in Texas after last weekend, but I would also attribute that to travel, the long weekend, people wanting to get out, and their reservations for restaurants are up about 35% from where they were in April, which is also, a good sign.
No, that is an encouraging sign. I guess it's, as I alluded to, it's a large country. Nice to see some places are starting to open. Even on a more you know, smaller geographic level, there's still some big differences going on. I mean, you're in
Right,
Massachusetts, still kind of locked down. I know
right.
you've got family in Rhode Island.
Yep.
Rhode Island's got a totally different environment there.
Yes. Yeah. Let me talk about that. So yeah, Jeff, you're over there in New York City. I'm here in Boston. We've been very strictly locked down, but I'm from Rhode Island and Massachusetts also borders Rhode Island. And Rhode Island actually started opening up restaurants a couple weeks ago. Only outdoor seating for now, but Rhode Island now is actually leading the United States in open table, meaning they're almost back to normal in the amount of people that are going out to eat today versus a year ago. And what I attribute that to, and this is just my personal opinion, is that a lot of people go to Rhode Island in the summertime and they go down to southern Rhode Island and eat out in places like Newport and Bristol and Portsmouth. And those places are on the water. So they're set up for outdoor seating already. And it's a small state. So that makes up a fair amount of, people going out to eat in the summer. So I think that those restaurants were in a good place to have outdoor seating available versus maybe the inner city, maybe Providence, where they're not so much set up for outdoor seating, they're indoor seating. So I think that's really helped with the summer crowds that come to Rhode Island and the fact that all of those big restaurants advertise outdoor seating anyway without coronavirus. And so, yeah, people have been going out to eat. My family, my friends are going out to eat and socializing again. And new cases are still trending down in Rhode Island. So I know it's a tiny state, but things are going well. It's really interesting.
Yeah, I think we do need to acknowledge here that, we're reopening the economy, and as you say, we've seen some increases in some states, but no real kind of big second wave. The protest here, I think, from a pandemic standpoint, are a little bit of a new variable in terms of all the reopening phases. Gathering in large groups would have been
Right.
at just the bottom of the list. Sporting
Hmm.
events were not going to happen anytime soon, at least not with a crowd. But now we're actually gathering in large groups right at the start of reopening. Uh, I think it's clearly too soon to say if this leads to a spike in cases. Of course, the hope is that it doesn't. Um, but the risk is heightened, and it's definitely something we're going to have to watch closely in the data here.
Right. No, I agree. It's definitely a new variable.
Okay, let me see if I can try and tie up a lot of what I'm hearing, and call me out if I'm off base on this, but I'd almost describe it as things are bad but getting better,
And I
right?
agree.
So, you know, you mentioned the open table data at the US. We essentially stopped eating out entirely. Now, collectively across the US, it's up about 15%, which is better than it was, but that's still nationally 85% below our usual level of eating out.
Right.
Or we could look at TSA tells us how many people are going through their checkpoints, essentially how many people are flying every day. And recently, about 300,000 people have been flying, which is a really big tick up from March and April, where there was only 100,000 people a day flying. So better, but usually 2 million people fly every day in the US. So we're
Right.
still kind of
Right.
well below normal activity levels. You can see that in consumer spending data, you can see it in the
Hmm.
manufacturing data, the mobility data you mentioned. We are starting to get out more, but it's still from just this very depressed level. So it
Right.
seems like things are bad, but the trajectory is good. They're getting better.
No, I absolutely agree, and I think putting it in context is helpful. Um, yeah, where things are improving, but where, if you look a year back from today, we're still at, you know, depressed level, like you said.
Well, this has been Jeff DeMaso and Liz Laprade from Advisor Investments, thanking you for listening to the Advisor You Can Talk To podcast. If you enjoyed this conversation, please subscribe and review our show. You can check us out at advisorinvestments.com/podcast. Your feedback really is always welcome. If you have any questions or topics that you'd like us to explore, please email us at info@advisorinvestments.com. Thanks for listening. Stay safe and keep others safe.